Access Fort Wayne offers reflections of our community. Production facilities provided by Access Fort Wayne are a service of the Allen County Public Library. The views and opinions expressed do not necessarily represent those of Access Fort Wayne, the Allen County Public Library, or any other supporting organizations. For more information about creating your own television program with Access Fort Wayne, call 421-1250.
Hello, and welcome to our show, The American Veteran. I'm Dale Parrish, your host, Carl Fowler's co-host, and our guest is Dr. Alfred Brothers. He just completed the show about his military experience. He'll be talking now about the black military history. Welcome to our show, Dr. Brothers.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here with you.
Yeah, no, you're quite involved in this history, I understand.
It's, again, genealogy and history both. And for me, it came about because of working, before I retired, I worked at Raytheon, and during one Black History Month, they said, well, we know very little about, Black American military history. So it was my task to develop a program relative to that. And again, it was interesting, again, because I had not thought about it in those terms either. Yes, my dad had, and we'll talk a little bit about that, and his brothers had fought in World War II. We'd never thought about anything else prior to that. And the military history of the African American goes all the way back to the Revolutionary War, and many people don't realize that, but they did. And it's interesting enough to know that African Americans I should say black soldiers fought on both in this case the British side as well as what we now know as the American side. And we had more fighting on the British side because they did not want to go back into slavery.
Right.
In that sense. So, and you also had an awful lot of black seamen as well, again, because they'd been fishermen before as well. The difference was the African Americans were fighting in individual segregated units at that time frame, where on board shipboard that didn't exist. All were treated equal, and they all served equally on the same ship. And for me, it was interesting because one of the most notable was a black loyalist called Colonel Ty. And again, he led his men and against the Americans, I might add, at this point in time. Okay. But a tremendous adversary, and our revolutionary brethren knew that. Unfortunately, he did lose his life. But one of the things that I did find out was that I had a relative, and his name was Thomas Hazard, and he had served in the Revolutionary War. He served as a servant to one of the northern generals up in New England, and had received a pension. So I was able to go actually research that and actually look at his real pension application at the archives in Massachusetts. So again, we were able to trace that particular history. Massachusetts had an all-black unit called the Bucks of America. Rhode Island had a unit. North Carolina had a unit. Louisiana had a unit. So again, you talk about people in all parts of the United States, African Americans who were involved in that particular war. There were roughly 6,000 on the loyalist or British side, and about 4,500 total on the revolutionary side. But then as you move forward, I knew not that much about the War of 1812. I knew what happened in that context. But again, you had battalions of colored men in Louisiana serving under in that time, Major General Andrew Jackson. They were an all-black unit, but served again under Andrew Jackson. So we had a black population of about 1.3 million in that situation, and you had African Americans. There were about 10,000 African Americans who were involved in that one. But the war that really hit my fancy was the Civil War. But again, right. we all knew about that part. Yeah. And the question was early on, how many African Americans really served in that area? We know the Civil War ran from 1860 to 1865, and one of the key things you recognize, and I'll give you the total numbers, you had, in terms of African Americans, well over let's see, he'll get it right here, well over 500,000 involved in that.
500,000.
Gee. Over time. And so, again, there were tremendous numbers of people involved on both sides. But the key in the Civil War was there were no fighting African American soldiers in the South. They all either were part of the transportation units, part of music units or that kind of thing, or even hospital units. But none were actively fighting, in this case, against the North.
They didn't want to give them guns, or
didn't want to give them guns. At the very, very last year, they changed their mind, but it was too late. I found two instances where they were claimed that there were African Americans fighting for the South. One was in Virginia, and a local militia, in fact, enlisted African Americans to fight with them. Then I read it in a book. One woman claimed that her husband had been part of one, but I can't find, even using the library here, that was actually the case. I don't know. Because if you remember, all these folks were slaves, and they were afraid to give them weapons at that particular time frame.
Yeah, given the time there and what was going on, you'd think that the Southerners would want to fight for the North. But getting to the North might have been a problem.
A problem, and that's the key. And that really was one of the key issues associated with it. Many did escape and did join, again, Northern black units, because they were typically all black. For example, the 54th and 55th out of Massachusetts. And I had relatives who served in both of those units. In this case, the last names were Monroe and Hazard. So in that situation, as a matter of fact, I had one relative killed at Fort Wagner. If you remember South Carolina, you remember the movie Glory. Yeah, so again, he was killed there in that situation. I had another one injured, but most of them of my family survived in that situation. So again, it was interesting to find out, where they served, how they served. One of them started out in the Navy. Served his year and a half, came back in and enlisted in cavalry, the colored cavalry. And so we have a picture of him at home, in his, Grand Army of the Revolution hat and uniform associated with that. But one of the things that occurred after the Civil War was that in the South, they had great reunions. And many of the former slaves, in fact, were part of those reunions because they had been part of the war process itself. Whether they were driving wagons, whether they were building fortifications, they were respected and part of those particular reunions. So again, and many also received pensions, I might add,
which we've never heard of.
Sure, and that's part of the story, the history. Recognizing what took place, and interestingly enough, I've read a couple of stories where some were servants and served with their masters in the war at the front, and in some cases the master got killed. And they would actually bring the body back home. Type situation, because they were that close in that situation. Many were not maltreated. Obviously, some were, as far as that goes. Yeah. But that's all they knew, and in that time frame. So again, that they were part of. I'll use the term greater family.
The master's home was their home also.
In that case, the plantation was. You betcha. In that context, yes.
Mm-hmm. So they was going back home.
Going back home in that sense, and those who were fighting, as I mentioned in Virginia, were thinking they were defending their home, right? Because that was their home also.
Well, that's where they lived. That's
true.
What they knew,
and that's very, very true.
You mentioned pensions. Did it say how much they got?
Ooh, I can't remember. I think it was
$1.50, maybe.
It may have been like $10 to $15, something like that. But again, only up to a particular period of time. And then what you'll see is you'll see information that the widow would continue the pension. She could continue that pension. Oh, okay. So again, you'll see records like that, and the records are here at the library here along that line as well. Yeah. So it's an interesting time frame.
Another thing I read the other night were. The embalming started in the Civil War because of the taking the body back home.
A key thing. And the other thing I was looking at was the idea of congressional medals of honor. And again, there were a couple congressional medals of honor winners. One was Christian Fleetwood in the Civil War. And again, as I mentioned, there's tremendous amount of information in terms of my family members because on a weekly basis, they had to write reports. And so you're able to find out, whether on duty in a hospital or what it was, and those reports still exist. And they're also, in this case, as there are today. When you leave the service, you get a discharge. In effect, they get discharge papers. I'll use that term as well. So again, you're able to prove that what unit they belong to, the date they were discharged. Also, in terms of some enlistment papers, get information about what they look like. How tall were they? How much do they weigh? So again, it puts more information about your relative that you may not know. And obviously, with some of them are actually pictures as far as that goes.
What about the term that I've sort of heard, 40 acres and a mule?
Oh yeah, that's true. Oh yeah, and again, 40 acres was enough for you to sustain a family with.
So that in lieu of a pension, or a pension work with that, or how did that
Two
work
things
out?
happen. Okay, we'll start with Revolutionary War. In the Revolutionary War, you also could get a land grant as well as a pension.
Okay.
Both of them.
Okay.
Okay. In the Revolutionary War, I'm sorry, in the Civil War, you could get a land grant, and you could also get a pension, or one or the other, depending upon where you live. For example, some people lived in cities, and obviously, didn't need the land grant to any stretch of the
So they got the pension.
Got the pension.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And the other part, and the next war obviously was the Indian Wars, and of course that's where the Buffalo Soldier came in play. And there were a number of Buffalo Soldier regiments, and matter of fact, there are still Buffalo Soldier regiments right now in the Army. They were brought back in that situation. Most fought obviously on the prairies and the like, and many were scouts. They guarded the stagecoaches. They were trying to help, moderate the behavior of Indians who, unfortunately, were defending their homeland. But again, they're American troops, and that's what they did.
Okay.
Then we go to the Spanish-American War, and again, we had a number of folks who fought in the Spanish-American War. 6 of whom won the Medal of Honor. Many were black Buffalo soldiers. We had troops here from Indiana who went to fight in the Spanish-American War units. So again, the ties, we've always had people in the military of African American heritage who are part of that process. And this is to say, just like any other cultural group has. But again, I personally had not known about the facts relative to African American history. Teddy Roosevelt had some of the African American units with him when he charged San Juan Hill.
Okay. According to the Medal of Honor, then these men distinguished themselves very much so in combat.
In combat, and obviously, in order to get them, obviously the white officers had to recommend them.
Right.
Yeah. In that situation. The other one was the Philippine insurrection, and many, I know our kids today would never even know what that was. But again,
well, I've heard of it.
It took place between 1899 and 1902. And again, the Philippine Republic wanted to break away because it was American territory at that time. They wanted to break away. Mm-hmm. And so we had to put down the revolution, and we, in fact, sent African-American troops in there with others as well. And the war actually ended in 1902. And the key thing, there were 125,000 U.S. soldiers fighting, and we had 4 regiments of Buffalo Soldiers, and there were 7,000 African-Americans involved. So again, you begin to recognize, that there has been a tremendous involvement.
That's a good percentage.
A very good percentage, right. And many of these units were activated and then deactivated.
Okay.
And then in some cases, you'll see later on that they were reactivated for World War I. Because when you look at it, World War I, we had over 4 million American sailors, soldiers, and airmen and Marines who in fact fought in that war. You had 350,000 African Americans in World War I.
Doughboys. Yep.
And we had 1 African American pilot, Eugene Jacques Ballard, in that situation, and we had 1 African American who was awarded the Medal of Honor in that particular time frame in World War I. And you'll hear about some African American units, 363rd, 364th, 365th, and 366th Infantry Divisions were developed in World War I. And some of them, in fact, had Buffalo Soldier units associated with them. Mm-hmm. My father was in the 366th in World War II. In World War II was a very interesting war because, again, African Americans were wanted to be part of the process. They recognized, again, that America had been hit by Germany. It had been hit by Japan, and they wanted to help sustain our way of life and our culture. And you talked about the Tuskegee Airmen, obviously, being a group of men who were chosen to learn how to fly at Tuskegee, and then President Roosevelt's wife was the one who persuaded him to fly, and they flew primarily fighters, but there were some bomber pilots. And one of the things that I learned when I was down at Tuskegee was that with the fighter units, they had black weatherman units. And it was interesting. Again, I'd forgotten that. Again, you had to have people who could predict the weather and weather patterns, so you could go fly. And so those were part of the unsung heroes who in fact, were part of that process. Again, Benjamin O. Davis, you remember hearing about that name. Had a chance to meet him also. He signed a book for me.
Good.
But again, led those outfits. The movie, talking about Red Tails and the like. It was interesting to see actually what the airplane looked like when I was down at Tuskegee. And as mentioned to you, again before we came on the air, that again, yes, I had roommates and roommate, and also half my pilot training class was German. When I was down visiting in Montgomery, Alabama, my German roommate and another classmate who's German and I went to Tuskegee. Okay. So again, it's interesting to say you have two fellows whose parents fought against the Americans, who are now pilots like I am, standing and looking at this museum. But they were interested to see exactly what had taken place, the training, the fiber of the people who were involved in that context. Yeah. And that was a very, very, very interesting time frame. But one of the other things that was very, very distinctive was the 761st Tank Unit, which is part of Patton's outfit, all black tank outfit.
Huh.
And again, a tremendous war record. It has a number of medals associated with it, and they prove their valor as well as the African American pilots. So again, but you don't know much about that particular unit at all.
I imagine the publicity they got wasn't up to par.
No, it did hit the mainstream in that sense, but obviously it was in the African American newspapers. But not the others in that context.
But the folks back home here didn't hear about it that much.
In that time frame. Also in that time frame, we think about women, and again we had African American women who served in the Nurse Corps. We had one who was a trained pilot. Her name was Willa Beatrice Brown. She was of the U.S. Civil Air Patrol. She was an instructor.
Okay.
So again, the bits and pieces of information do evolve over time, but it takes quite a bit of time to pull that information together.
Mm-hmm.
You've heard of the Black Ball Express, right?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, the Red Ball Express.
Red Ball, yeah.
Okay. Those are all African Americans.
Oh, okay.
And they were part of transportation units that provided supplies to the front line.
Sure, truck drivers and so forth.
You better believe it. That's true.
Mm-hmm.
One of the key things that, again, for me was a story that my father kept telling about. I could hear. He was a commander of an AM vet post in Boston, talking about a fellow by the name of Lieutenant Fox. They always whisper about Lieutenant Fox. I didn't know who was Lieutenant Fox. Well, in the research, I found out Lieutenant Fox was part of his outfit. And what he had done was he was part of a crew that was out doing reconnaissance. And he was trapped in a house surrounded by Germans in that case. And he was taking fire, obviously. And he called fire upon himself and the people around him and destroyed a large number of German soldiers at that particular period of time. Well, he eventually got the Medal of Honor.
He didn't survive, though.
Did not survive, no.
Right.
Did not survive. But one of the things was I said, let me confirm this. I think you remember a gentleman who just passed away here in the last 2 months, former Senator Edward Brooke. He was the first black senator since Reconstruction. Well, again, he was my father's commander in World War II. He had an office with my dad in a building in Boston, so they knew each other very, very well. And I called him last year and said, I heard this. Is it true? And he said, yes. He said, I haven't thought about this in how many years out?
But you refreshed his mind.
But refreshed his mind, and I was able to talk to him about it. But again, things, many people who come back from the war don't talk very much about it.
Right. Yeah. Because the audience out there, the people, wouldn't understand what really went on anyways.
Oh, it's also painful if you think about it in some respects too.
Yeah.
If you think about it, it's very, very painful. But particularly World War II,
sure.
and that situation where you've sent millions of men and women overseas, and men primarily who were the fighters, but so many of them didn't come back, and the fighting was so brutal, and they really
So much
couldn't
carnage.
and they couldn't really talk about it. You know, they didn't want to bring the memories back. So it's much harder to really elicit that information from in this case, from your fathers or grandfathers. And unfortunately, many of those who served in World War II are unfortunately leaving us very, very quickly here.
Yeah. You could think of the books that could have been written, right?
And
The stories that could have been told.
Yeah, and I think going through all of this, I began to recognize that other cultures as well as African Americans have a long tradition and history in the military. It's interesting to find out that we did so in the African American community. Again, there are many. In this case, the Army Air Corps, Navy. There weren't any in the Marines, but there were in other units as well. In fact, we fought from the Revolutionary War up to today. And my research really only took me up through World War II because Korea and Vietnam are much fresher in our minds in that context. Yeah. And the lesson was really to let people know that a tradition, history did exist.
Well, I think that probably our country, in the position it's in, wouldn't be here without the contributions that the black military provided.
It was part of the fabric of the greater military, and that's correct. It's true. It's part of the fabric of it. And again, each, no matter what your background, whether they were the Navajo Indians who participated obviously in a great way. We had Italian Americans who again went to Italy to fight. You had German Americans who went over. You had Japanese Americans who also fought as well. So again, everyone made contributions to try to maintain and sustain our way of life. So again, all of us had to pull together to win that war.
Yes.
Well, it's a good thing. We actually did pull together, and it was very successful.
And I think it also pulled us together another way because it took us out of our comfort zones and allowed us to work together, where in many cases you couldn't do that. We were talking about the Tuskegee Airmen flying the P-51s, defending bombers. In that case, and most of the bomber pilots, 99% of them, were obviously white at that particular period of time. But again, they built up a relationship because the Tuskegee Airmen, their tactics changed, and they would follow the bombers all the way.
Right, protect them.
And so they set up a sense of rapport between them, beginning to recognize we're in this together, and when we can do it together.
Yep, they made a name for themselves.
Well, you're always going to lose some bombers, according to Flak, but with the P-51 Tuskegee Airmen, you didn't lose them to other airplanes.
And that was the key, really.
And so those more bombers went in and was able to deliver their loads and become more successful. It was a win-win situation, wasn't it?
It certainly was. And going back to my, I did mention in the last period, when I was an Air Force ROTC commander at Wright State University, we had a guest come into, in this case, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. He had been the chief scientist for Churchill in World War II. He was the one who helped develop radar.
Okay.
And he also was a fellow who would send information to partisans on what in Europe in terms of what targets they attacked. Well, he came to speak to my detachment. I had him speak that one time, and our neighbor brought one of her friends. And at the end of that discussion, her friend stood up and said, "I want to thank you," because she had been a French partisan, one of those who he had directed. So as I mentioned, things go full circle. You're talking about only 6 degrees of freedom,
right?
In that sense, and in terms of who knows who.
Yeah.
The world is very, very small in that context.
Yeah.
Things come back and visit you again after many years sometimes.
And very positive. You get some positive feedback in terms of what things have taken place.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
You sure done a lot of research. Took you a lot of time.
It's been interesting. The research part of it, and again, I begin to recognize all of us can do the same thing in terms of military history and our own families. And I think it's interesting to do that, to recognize those who have been part of the military, in each and every one of our families.
Now, there's not all black units now, is there?
No.
Okay, because they integrated when we was in.
Well, again, if you remember, it was actually President Truman that gave out that order.
And then it took a couple of years to get it.
It takes time. It takes time.
Yeah, sure.
But again, you see so many African Americans and others in command positions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And as a result of it, my younger cousin was an assistant undersecretary of defense for the Army here for a couple of years. So again, things do go full circle in terms of where people use their talents and their energies best.
Yeah, sure.
I think now it's getting down to how are you qualified for the position.
And I think that's the key, because this way you're able to use the brain trust and skills of all of your population.
Right.
And each one of us can contribute differently in that sense.
That's why they say this country is greater than most, because of the...
You get different points of view.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, we're developing and still growing and getting to know each other, but I think we're willing to take that opportunity. Other countries haven't done as well as we have in that context. And you're willing to listen in that sense, too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been to Europe a couple times, and it's a different experience there than what it is here. And I think here you have opportunities, and over there you don't. There's lots of opportunities you don't have.
And the cultures have developed differently, if you think about it. Again, I won't use the term necessarily a melting pot, but you have an amalgamation of people here where that doesn't necessarily occur as easily in some other countries.
Yeah.
I think of one of the other countries that does it very well is Canada in that context. I've got relatives, again, my family came from Canada after leaving Virginia during the Revolutionary War. But again, they've done well up there too. So it just depends upon the country and how it's developed. Where more established countries, they've got different traditions, and so it's harder to become part of the fabric of that particular country.
Right, because they resist change.
Very much so.
Yeah.
But I think we're all guilty of that
Here
sometimes.
in the United States, we change all the time, don't we?
I think you're right there.
Sometimes you can't keep up with it.
Well, we probably got maybe a half a minute or so. Anything you want to close with?
Well, I think the best thing I could say is that America is great because of the contribution of all of its people. That we can make that greatness even better as we accept each other more and more. That the only way we can grow and develop is growing and develop together.
Yeah.
And I think it is going in that direction. I think it's headed that way. Like I say, it may take time, but we're seeing more and more compatibility as time goes by.
Well, we're out of time again.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Brothers.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
I'm very happy to be with you. Thank you so very much.
Okay.
I hope you enjoyed our show. I certainly did. Remember, freedom is not free, so if you see a veteran or someone in uniform, just walk up to them, shake their hand and say, thank you for your service. Well, thank you, and good evening.